Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, and I am joined today by
Chris Garrett
and Annie Berglund.
All right, guys, we are almost to the end of Unit 3, so we're recording this webisode to kind of pull the pieces together and think a little bit about, we're a week out or so from the exam, think a little bit about this third unit. So let's start it right off. Annie, we're going to start with our standard question. So every time we have a new era, we have somebody sort of make the case why this is the most important or most significant time we study. So Annie, why is the Enlightenment the most significant period we study in CWC?
Man, saying most is always scary, but here we go. I'll try to give my rationale here. So I think that, first of all, the reason why I think it's most important is that it's kind of selfish, right? Because now we start seeing contemporary Western values develop much more. We kind of come out of more medieval sense of source of authority, of where you find truth, into what looks more modern. We have like values of individualism, of human progress, of human rights, and that language that surround those ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. But there's also some other key takeaways. So one reason it's significant is that we have a celebration of human reason. So we have someone like Kant who writes that the Enlightenment is the courage to seek understanding, to seek your own understanding. So we start seeing that wrestling with questions on your own and trying to come up with answers to questions is a form of enlightened thinking, and it should. And rather than just blindly looking to authorities or tradition, specifically church tradition. So we start seeing a shift towards secularism and answering some of those questions regarding even things like economics or what our political structure should look like, or our healthcare systems or our education. It's like this is applied to all fields, and how we can make reason enter into all avenues of our life. There's also a shift to seeing human history as one of progress. So it's not so much cyclical or like there's an endpoint, but instead like us as humans, we're making life better, and that like finding answers, innovating, discovering things, it can actually, like, our reason can lead to making life easier and happier and better than it was before. And so certainly it's a really optimistic time, and there's some great thinkers and ideas that come out of it, but there's also kind of a dark side to the Enlightenment where I find it to be most fascinating for this class. So we have the idea of like shifting from the divine right theory of political structures, so the idea that God designates power to political authorities, and then shifting that to the social contract theory, with folks like John Locke saying that our individual rights of life and liberty and property should be upheld and protected by the state, and that we enter this mutual agreement. And so we have these like developing notions of individual rights during the Enlightenment, but these rights aren't for everybody. And so I think what I really like is when we start complicating the Enlightenment more and we consider how, yes, like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, were aided by theories of John Locke, theories of rights, and when rights are infringed upon, that we can revolt, that we can reclaim our rights, that we can change government for ourselves. But those revolutions occur among and for elites in society. And so I think that it's important we consider how Enlightenment ideas on the surface seem great, reason and virtue, but at the same time, they're used in justification of creating further hierarchies, racial hierarchies, or suppressing women. And that reason is that justification. So there's a lot to take away there, but those are some of the main significances that I find in this unit.
Well, that was a great webisode. See you guys next time.
Sorry.
No, that was fantastic. You touched on so many important things. That was great.
Well, the 18th century is also a time for religious awakenings, which I hadn't talked about yet. But Chris, I was wondering if you could tell us what evangelicalism is. That word is still thrown around a lot. Could you tell us what it is and how it emerges from this time of enlightenment as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fraught term, right? We've probably just heard this a lot just because we're looking at exit polls from the election a couple weeks ago, and it's almost more a political term than a religious term. But if you're talking about the 18th century in places like England or Wales or North America, evangelicals are often defined by four things. So at least two of them should just sound a lot like the Protestant Reformation. Like, evangelicals treat the Bible as their highest authority for belief. not a creed, not a church teaching, not an affirmation, but the Bible itself, right? Which is a way of going back to sola scriptura. Evangelicals believe deeply in original sin, and that it's not by our effort, but by God's grace through faith that we're saved, right? And so it's the work of Jesus on the cross that matters most. And so in some ways, it just kind of sounds like we're back to the Reformation. What I think really makes it different are the other two pieces. So one idea is evangelicals believe that authentic Christianity requires some kind of conversion. And for a lot of them, it's like a really dramatic experience, right? John Wesley having his heart strangely warmed one night in May 1738, or something even more dramatic than that. Some of these are really wild, almost supernatural kinds of stories of people's life just changing. Some are more gradual, but this is not necessarily something Luther or Calvin wrote a lot about, or the Anabaptists wrote a lot about. And in a sense, it should kind of echo some of what Annie said about the Enlightenment being this era of individualism. This is a much more personal kind of religion. You can't just participate in it as part of a group. You can't just be born into a Christian territory and just kind of be baptized into the church. There's got to be this kind of like decisive moment in your life. What's different from the Enlightenment is that it's not just private, right? Deists would emphasize it's fine to have these deeply held personal beliefs as long as you keep them private to some extent. Evangelicals are going to take this all very public. They're going to write conversion stories like Augustine did, and they're going to evangelize and preach in open air and in town squares. And so the fourth criterion here is evangelicals are believe in what's called activism, evangelism, missions, going out, converting people. I mean, there's some of the first great Protestant missionaries, but they also believe in social action. They also believe in reform movements. Some of them become abolitionists as we get into the story of the slave trade. And in that sense, they do kind of echo the Enlightenment in that they believe in progress. They believe that we're not just here to kind of leave things be, but we're actually supposed to leave people, individuals, and society better than we found it. So they're coming from a different direction than maybe some of the more secular Enlightenment thinkers, but they do have that kind of optimism about what can happen in the 18th century. All right, Sam, let's put the two halves of Unit 3 together. What are a couple of connections you see between the Reformations, where we started the unit, and the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, where we ended it?
I love this question because this is all about kind of really laser focusing, preparing for the exam. I'm going to give you three to think about. When we think about the divide or the difference between the Reformation and the Enlightenment, we can think about this as a debate about authority and how we understand authority. So these are going to often spin around that. So one pairing would be thinking about someone like Ignatius Loyola, who gives us a Catholic Reformation figure who gives us a very pretty intense picture of where he's looking for authority, right? He's looking to the church for an authority, in part as a remedy to some of the problems he sees with the Protestant Reformation, some of the complexities of sola scriptura, right? If everybody can interpret scripture themselves, then how do we ever know if we're right? And Loyola is going to say the church actually is the authority we look to, right? That's different than someone like Martin Luther saying sola scriptura and my conscience is captive to the word of God, but whose interpretation? Loyola is saying, well, the church's interpretation. And we can contrast that with somebody like Immanuel Kant. I think Dr. Yim even talked about this in lecture, right? Kant is saying the Enlightenment is all about having the courage to use your own understanding, to think for yourself, to not look to this exterior authority, but look to reason as an authority. So I think that's a great pairing to think about. And we could interchange lots of people on either side of that. But I think thinking about that as a type of connection. I would also say, if we're thinking about political authority, this unit gave us two distinct pictures of political authority. Annie already talked a little bit about this. I would look at Luther's secular authority and look at John Locke. And Luther is talking about how the government comes from God. So that makes it, even though he's talking about secular government, he looks at the government as this thing that's kind of sacred, right? You're not allowed to revolt against it. You're not allowed to do that because it's something put in place by God. So you would do that at your own peril. Where Locke is saying, no, government is this thing that's created by us. It's the power of the government doesn't come from God. It comes from the consent of the governed. And therefore, I think the real power of Locke, right, is that he says, if the government's not fulfilling its function, which is for Locke protecting natural rights, specifically the right to property, then you can have a revolution, tear it down and build another one. So I think that's it's still a question of authority, but it's thinking about understanding political authority in two different ways. Last one I'll give you is actually kind of a triumvirate, and it is thinking about the Reformation and connecting it to one of two other terms, either deism, right? Deism is in some ways a response to the wars of religion which grow out of the Reformation and all the divides that happen. Or you can connect it to the Reformation to pietism, because pietism is a revival of the Reformation, right? So I think that's another way to think about how we're thinking about these terms interacting with each other. Chris, in segment 2, we're going to play Food Chain, which is my favorite game, but we're going to not let you play this time. It's just going to be Andy and I. So as we're preparing our lists, do you have any dark horse candidates for people that we might not be thinking of, that might be able to sneak into maybe that number 5 spot on a top 5?
I was already talking about Immanuel Kant, then both of you talked about Immanuel Kant already in the segment, so I will shift gears. Part of me wants to make the case for Adam Smith right here, because we tend to overlook economics, but he's not even a mastery term in this unit. So instead, I will argue for John Wesley, who I think it's easy for Wesley to slip through the cracks. I mean, most students don't come from Methodist churches, which is the most direct outgrowth of what Wesley does in England and America. Some come from holiness or Pentecostal churches, but they wouldn't recognize that as being Wesleyan. So like, this is not necessarily a figure most of us have grown up knowing in our context. But he is one of the most important figures in modern Christian history, and certainly in the Great Awakening of the 1730s, 1740s, and the birth of evangelicalism. He's kind of this nice connection between other sorts of evangelicals and German pietism. What I especially like about Wesley is the reading we give you. This is called The Case of Reason Impartially Considered. So this is a sermon that Wesley preached pretty late in life. He was about 78 years old. So this is during the American Revolution. And I think it's almost a way of like elaborating on what Pascal had said almost 150 years earlier. I love people who want to find like this middle path, right? I don't know if it's just that I'm indecisive or I hate conflict, but like I love people who want to say it doesn't have to be either extreme, right? And so Wesley says, well, I mean, there are those who despise and vilify reason, and they think that it's just revelation from God. And he's not scornful of that, but he's wary of that. People who in the midst of the Enlightenment just go too far the other direction and say true faith is supernatural faith, it's revelation, it's mystical experience. You know, Wesley is familiar with the Enlightenment. He corresponds with Enlightenment skeptics. And he says, no, there's a lot that reason can do, and Christians should be attentive to that. And then most of the sermon, he's warning against the other kind of extreme. Just like Pascal had warned, like, we're going to lose everything mysterious and faithful if we make it all about reason. Wesley says reason can't really produce faith. It can't really produce hope of a Christian sort. And most importantly, he says near the end of the reading, reason, however cultivated and improved, cannot produce the love of God. It cannot produce either faith or hope from which alone that love can flow. And that reminds me of Pascal saying that if you just tried to make religion based on reason, you wouldn't have the love expressed in the Son being sent in the person of Jesus Christ, right? So I like Wesley as this person who's working out even more than Pascal, this kind of tension in the midst of the Enlightenment.
So, Chris, when we get to Food Chain, he may not. I was saving number 5 for your pick. I was just going to throw that in there, but I might have to come up with somebody else for number 5 because I'm loving Wesley, and he might be even higher than that.
This is why we should really do rehearsal for these webisodes. But no, amazingly, students, you won't believe this. We just kind of throw this together at the last minute. I'm sorry to kind of rip back the curtain, but sorry, that's how it works. Okay, one more exam to go. Any last words of advice before students take their test on the Monday before Thanksgiving?
Oh man, so for most of my students, they did really well on the objective portion, and so I would say focus more on the subjective parts, on the connection questions specifically. Make sure that I have students who will write really great detailed context, but they'll spend so much time on the context of the terms, even kind of unwrapping parts of the context that is irrelevant to the connection. So like consider the context as 2 building blocks that are getting you to the connection between the two, right? So use the things that are most important that build upon how you're going to support that connection. Maybe don't put in irrelevant information just to put it in, right? I feel like that's always, it's nice to put more and more and more in there, but you don't have a lot of time. So find the crucial things and be succinct. Also, always helpful to brainstorm potential connection questions, maybe make a list or like a web of similar ideas or beliefs or categories from the unit. And don't neglect mastery terms from Unit 1 or Unit 2, because we can also draw from those for the connection questions as well.
We are tricky that way. Okay, well, that's our review of Unit 3. one version of it. We're going to come back in a second, and Annie and Sam are going to do a different kind of review of Unit 3 by picking their top 5 most important people from throughout the unit. We call it food chain. Back in a second.
All right, welcome back for segment 2. We're going to be playing a little game called Food Chain, where we talk through the most important figures of Unit 3. So we're going to have a top 5 list, working our way up to number 1. Annie, why don't you kick us off?
Man, okay, so you said the prompt is the most important person, and here I have a group of people. So my top one is, or number 5 for me is the Peasants' War. And it feels like it's cheating because not only is that like a massive group of different revolts over like a century, but it's also multiple people. But I think it's really important for this unit because, well, it happens at the start, but it's kind of a precursor for this discussions that we have later on. So we mentioned a little bit earlier, I think it was actually Sam that mentioned this, connecting Luther and his approach to the Peasants' War versus what maybe Locke would say if he were to critique or to consider what the peasants wanted. So I think that the Peasants' War is helpful because not only does it show us that the Reformations wasn't a monolith, like that there are multiple forms of Reformations, that it's reformations, not shun, that even within the radical Reformation groups, you have different perspectives and fiercely held disagreements. But also it shows this difference in from radical reformers to the more magisterial reformers, some of these more extreme levels of how much can we apply the gospel to politics, to economics, to our social lives. And they would argue often, especially the peasants, that it should be applied that way, that that's what being a Christian is. And there would be an impulse then to make society more equal, just like we would with the church. And it also complicates Luther for us too. I think the peasants' revolts, it's interesting because it gives us an example of a grassroots local level of change, something that we don't necessarily see. We usually study people that have more influence. And it helps to critique some of those people on top, like Luther, who obviously said to the princes to destroy, to kill the peasants because they went against secular authority. So that's my first one. I don't know. Did I go too long? Did I talk too much?
No, that's perfect. And I actually really like that choice. And as we built these lists, we'll pull back the curtain a little more. So I saw your list as I built mine, and so my list is really going to provide sort of a conservative counterpoint to your list. So I'm intentionally pulling some different people, although we do have some overlap because I think there's some names that have to be on there. So number 5 on my list is John Calvin. And the reason that I picked Calvin is because I think he's important for pushing the Reformation beyond sort of what the Reformation was initially about, right? About corruption in the church and sort of this divide. So what we get with Calvin is the beginnings of a sustained Reformation. He's really imagining, like, how do we think differently about the church? How do we think systematically about Protestant theology? So he really is, thinking about building I think a more sustained tradition, right? So it's no mistake that his tradition comes to be known as the Reformed tradition. I think because this is where he's trying to take that. So I think his impact on Christian theology is really important. I mean, even if you don't agree with his particular theology, I think he's really significant for how he pushes the Protestant Reformation in that direction. So I'm putting him as number 5 on my list. Who do you have at number 4?
Number 4, I just went over how, look at me, I have groups of people, social history, and then for the rest of my group, it's just people. But Newton is really important. I don't think that I could have a list for Unit 3 without having Newton on it. I don't know if you put him on yours, Sam, but he's important not only because of his contribution to science and to understanding the laws of gravity, how the universe works, but he's also important in exemplifying the scientific method. And these ideas that, like, there are universal principles that govern the world and that we can actually discover those, and we can it helps to explain nature to us. And not just explain, but that nature can be something that we can predict. And if we can predict something, then we can use it, right? And we can use it for our own betterment. So his whole idea of, like, that there are these universal truths that are knowable and we can discover them through reason. I think that's one of those guiding principles of the scientific revolution. And certainly like why the earth moves around the sun, why the moon moves around the earth, all of those types of natural processes are things that we can understand and predict.
I love that choice. He might be showing up a little bit later for me. I might think you have him too low on your list. Number 4, I'm putting Elizabeth the First. And I'm doing this because I find that the 16th century is really interesting religiously because there's so much dispute and there's so much focus on thinking about church purity, right? Even the Catholic Reformation, which is interested in unity, is also thinking about purity as well, because right, they're trying to say we need to reaffirm a particular view and a particular authority. So I'm really moved by Elizabeth's story in a number of ways. I mean, for one thing, she is looked at by her father as, oh, there's no way England can succeed if we have, my daughter as queen. And we see his other children, Edward and Mary, right, pretty short reigns for different reasons. And again, during their reigns, we're seeing this push for purity. Elizabeth comes to the throne, rules for a very long time, is one of the most powerful monarchs in Western history. Not just for the length of her rule, but with the way that she rules. And, I think the Elizabethan compromise is so important. It's not exactly religious toleration, but it's a step in that direction. I think focusing on the unity of her people, I think she at least pushes off religious civil war in England until after she dies. Like she manages to maintain that. I think that's important. And then, I think sometimes significance isn't always about things that in retrospect we think are the greatest, but like she's going to be parts of the real origins of what we're going to think of as like the British Empire, which is going to be unbelievably important as we move into the 18th, 19th, 20th century. So I think she's just such a crucial, important person. So she's number 4 on my list. Who do you have at number 3?
Number 3, I have John Locke. And we mentioned him already a couple times here, but I think that he's really important, especially because he's hugely important to our own life here in the U.S., right? Like the language that he uses to describe rights and to describe the roles of political authorities, that is found in our own founding documents and really aided future democratic revolutions in France, in the U.S., and more. So he's important for that reason. And also he's important because, again, he's showing this split now from perhaps a more conservative medieval perspective of political authority. And so the idea that men is an important word, right? But that all men are entitled to life and liberty and property, and that the government is established to uphold those rights. And he has this idea that, like, us as citizens, we should be following the rules of government. Like we have entered into this contract with the government, but we should also have a say in how those rules are managed, like how that government is established. And if there's any way that the government fails to represent our rights, then we can revolt. And we see how that's such a different perspective than Luther would have held, or maybe a more medieval conservative view, that there's a divine right to authority. And that it is much more top down. So there's that.
All right.
What's your number 3?
And number 3, I also have John, but it's a different John. I have John Wesley. So Chris's dark horse candidate wasn't that dark of a horse. I think John Wesley's super important. So I'm not going to repeat all the things that he said in segment 1. There's really 2 things I think that I want to point on. For one thing is he is really influential for reviving religious revival, bringing people who are kind of unchurched back into the church, right? In England, and then the spread of Christianity as well, sort of Protestant missions work. He's going to play a big role in that. You probably don't have American Christianity in the way we think about it without John Wesley. The American frontier Christianity is Wesleyan Methodist Christianity. So along with everything Dr. Garrett said, I think Wesley is such a crucial person. If we're thinking about Christianity and Western culture, I think to not have Wesley, we're missing something. Who do you have at number 2?
Hey, I think it's somebody we haven't mentioned yet at all, who is Wollstonecraft. Have we mentioned her yet in this episode?
I don't think so.
All right, good, because I love her. So she is a figure that, again, I mentioned before that my favorite part of this unit is complicating the Enlightenment, and she is one of those figures that does so. And so she reveals in her writing that the Enlightenment is only possible for a portion of society, right? The Enlightenment, this idea of like, it takes courage to seek and discover your own understanding, that's something that is only capable or only really possible for people who have the time and the resources and the rights to make that happen. And so there's portions of society that just can't benefit from that. These pushes, these ideals for reason and human progress. And so she defines these ideas that there's like the social political sphere, and that's for men, and then there's the private sphere for women, and rights are denied for women because they're functioning in the private sphere alone. So as a good former student and former CWC TA, I would like to submit some evidence for this one. Can I read a little passage for you?
If you can, please do.
All right, I would love to. So if you're listening in, page 175 in the reader, we have Mary Wollstonecraft, who says, "Would men but generously snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of slavish obedience, they would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens." And then on the backside, she says, "To be a good mother, a woman must have sense and that independence of mind which few women possess, who are taught to depend entirely on their husbands. I now only mean to insist that unless the understanding of women be enlarged and her character rendered more firm by being allowed to govern her own conduct, she will never have sufficient sense or command of temper to manage her children properly." So even reason is important in the private sphere too for women to possess. And I think she's fascinating because she's taking Enlightenment values and using them as a critique of the Enlightenment and of Enlightenment thinkers, and saying, why are you denying citizenship and rights to this part of the population, when if we had that, we would be better citizens. We would be better for society if we had the same amount of education and ability.
Nice. So who do I have at number 2? And I'm realizing now that 60% of my list is people named John. We've already had John Calvin, John Wesley. Number 2 on my list is John Locke. For all the reasons you talked about, he's so unbelievably important. Restructuring or reimagining the way we think about political authority, natural rights, the right to revolution. I think that's the one that I talked about in segment 1, but that's the real powerful idea. It's one thing to talk about social contract. It's one thing to talk about natural rights and government's supposed to protect rights, but it's another thing to give a rational justification for political revolution. And it's not just something that's happening in theory, right? He's writing this in 1688, 89 in response to kind of justifying the Glorious Revolution. And he is laying the groundwork for the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and quite frankly, for democratic revolutions that we see up to this very day. So I think Locke is really important. So he's number 2 on my list. Who do you got at number 1?
Number 1, I have Equiano, and I put him on there because, man, with other conversations we've had in this class, I just think he's crucial, especially in how he complicates Western history and the fact that progress often comes from the suppression of people. And so, progress in quotes, right? And so Equiano, we know he's enslaved, he was freed, he converted to Christianity, and he wrote a memoir of being captured in Africa, of the slave trade. And his memoir is significant because it spread throughout the English population, and it became an important tool, important piece of legislation or a piece of literature to help support the abolishment of the slave trade in England. But he's also important again because, like Wollstonecraft, he's another individual who uses Enlightenment reasoning to critique Enlightenment thinkers, in saying that, yes, you value virtue and you value reason, but you're not applying, and justice, but you're not applying that to the entire population. And so in his memoir, you'll read in the CWC reading packet that he appeals to both religion and reason, as explaining why human beings shouldn't be enslaved, why enslaving them is wrong. And he says that slavery deprives enslaved people from their virtue, and it forces them to live a life at war with the slave owner. And then on the flip side, slavery also degrades the slave owners too, and it holds them responsible for these atrocities and horrors that slavery causes. So his rationale is obviously it's important and conflicting and convicting to the people of the time too.
All right. Here's who I have at number one. Very different list. Now, this is a name you've already mentioned. Here's where I have Isaac Newton. And I think, when people make the list of the most important individuals in Western history, Newton is often number one on that list, but always at the very top of it. So I just want to hit some of the highlights here. Some of it's reiterating things you said, some of it's expanding on that. But he literally changes the way we think about how the world works, right? With Newton, we get this shift from thinking of the world like this living organism. I mean, in the Middle Ages, people thought of the world as a living organism whose beating heart was God. And after Newton, people look at the world as this rational machine that we can study, we can understand, and we can harness and use. Mm. It's a radically different way to think about it. He turns the world into a rational machine, or he uncovers that it always was a rational machine. His thinking, his science leads to the Enlightenment. He's uncovering these laws of nature in the sciences, and people are so enamored by that idea that they say there's got to be these rational principles in other aspects of life. That's why we get a John Locke and an Adam Smith and people like that saying, maybe there are these rational principles that describe how everything works. That's the Enlightenment project. He shifts the way we think about time and progress, right? I mean, in some ways, he introduces this notion of progress. I mean, in the Middle Ages, people didn't think the world was going to change, the world was going to get better. It just, the world is. You do what your parents did, your children will do what you did. And Newton is, in the way that he affects the Enlightenment or pushes the Enlightenment into existence, right? That we start to have this view of history as this thing that is progressing, this thing that is changing. And if we're using that Martin Buber language of homelessness and habitation, he really helps to establish a new habitation, the habitation of science and reason. And it's a habitation that we probably still have a foot in the year 2020. We're also pushing against that. I mean, I think about he ushers in the modern age. We think about ourselves living in a postmodern age, which shows that we still have a foot in modernity and maybe a foot in homelessness. Mm-hmm. So I just think that's an interesting way to think about it. Newton is just unbelievably important. It's interesting as I look at our two lists. I'm curious to your thoughts on this, but I feel like if we went back 100 years to the year 1920, I think my list would be a pretty common list. You would see something like that. I think your list wouldn't be. I think your list really does speak to kind of the new ways we're sort of looking at the world. Like you have three people on there who are speaking for the marginalized, speaking for the oppressed, right? And that's why I said I as a counter to that, purposely built a very conservative list to say here are two really different ways for thinking about this history.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember as a student of history at Bethel, one of the first classes I took was with Dr. Magnuson, and she introduced us to the idea of historiography and the idea that there are different ways that we study history over time. And now we're probably in a period where social history or history of the marginalized, especially coming out of the civil rights movement, that's where, my list would be much more, I guess, contemporary than maybe the list that you had, which is more about these elites. Of course, they're all important, but yeah, interesting.
They're all also white. 4 of them are men. 3 of them are named John. So there's not a lot of diversity in that list.
No, not really.
Well, Annie, this was really fun to do. I hope this is helpful for students we do this not just to amuse ourselves, but to do this as a way to review some of these big ideas, some of these big terms, and think about why they're significant. We will be back in just a second to wrap up the show with Happy Time.
Okay, back for the culmination of our last webisode, the Unit 3 webisode. It's Happy Time. You guys ready?
I'm ready.
Amy?
Ready.
Okay, happy birthday to Lisa Bonet. Denise Huxtable on The Cosby Show and A Different World is 53 today. Sam, do you have a favorite child star of 1980s sitcom fame?
I'm a little nervous about this because by referencing the show, The Cosby Show and A Different World and Denise Huxtable, we've already lost all of our viewers because these are so old. So I'm going to just lose them even more. So, I was thinking about what some of our options are. In some ways, Michael J. Fox is the most obvious. He just retired from seeking acting roles, but he was in his 20s when the 80s started. He was like 19 or 20 when the 80s started. So then I thought about Kirk Cameron, who's sort of like a step down maybe in the 80s from Michael J. Fox. But his career kind of fizzled out. In fact, Candace Cameron probably does more than he does at this point. So actually, I'm going with the person who I think had a fantastic 1980s and then went on to, in some ways, even bigger and better things. And that is Jason Bateman. Let me run through some of the stats here, right? So Jason Bateman was on Little House on the Prairie from 1981 to 1982. 1983, 1984, he's on Silver Spoons. He does 21 episodes of each of those. And then in the late 80s, he's on Valerie, which becomes Valerie's Family, which becomes the Hogan Family for 110 episodes. In the intermediate time, he's on an episode of Knight Rider, an episode of Mr. Belvedere, an episode of St. Elsewhere, an episode of Matlock, and stars in Teen Wolf 2. The 90s are really dark for Jason Bateman, but the 2000s, this millennia has been fantastic. You have Arrested Development, movies, Ozark. That's your guy.
I'm so glad I asked that question.
All right. Happy anniversary to, wow, we're just doing all the old stuff. Happy anniversary to Milli Vanilli. The pop duo was stripped of their Grammy Awards 30 years ago today after it was revealed that they didn't sing at all on their own album. Annie, if you could win a Grammy for lip syncing, whose voice would you use?
This is a hard question. I have lip synced Justin Bieber before, but he's not my choice. Though I visually feel like I could pass for Justin Bieber as well. My choice is Harry Styles. So now we're getting into the 21st century, boys. We're here. Harry Styles, I chose because right now there's actually like this huge controversy on Twitter because he came out with a photo shoot for Vogue. And in it, he chooses these outfits that are kind of gender bending, to put it in a term that probably people don't use much anymore, but you know what I mean. And so he pushes the envelope of fashion, which I think is incredible and interesting, especially like I didn't grow up with David Bowie, but it kind of reminds me of a David Bowie kind of fashion sense. And his voice is like buttery and beautiful. And it also would allow me to kind of do a callback to some of the One Direction hits from when I was in high school, which is always thrilling. He had like a great comeback. Him and the Jonas Brothers, never saw that coming. How do you guys feel about that?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you did not try to do a Jonas Brother, but Harry Styles actually has a pretty decent Tiny Desk concert on NPR. And he's actually a very funny kind of performer too. His James Corden stuff is pretty good.
Oh yeah, he's so funny.
Yeah.
So throughout my cue
you just wanted to showcase that lovely CWC mug that someone you know has made.
Yes. Yeah. My husband made this. Looks familiar, huh? Well, okay, happy trails to 70-degree temperatures and big social gatherings with this incoming cold. Chris, cold weather's here. COVID cases are on the rise. How are you and your family planning to hunker down and survive the socially distant winter?
The key phrase here is board games. Like, we play a lot of board games to start with, but our usage of board games has gone off the charts recently. So we're kind of stuck. We're playing, there's a Hogwarts board game. I forgot, there are actually two, and I forgot what it's called. We're in year 6, and we cannot get out of year 6. Because, man, Fair Greyback, when he shows up, you can't add any of your energy back, and you just keep dying. You keep getting stunned over and over. So that's a nut we have not yet cracked. We have a national parks board game that we really like, that we've been playing a lot. And then Isaiah has requested like 2 or 3 pretty fancy ones. Like, there's a Settlers of Catan American History version that's at the top of his Christmas list. So we have to delay our gratification a little bit and wait for December. Or they have birthdays like 2 weeks before Christmas. Maybe we won't have to wait that long. But it's all about board games for the Garrett's family. Well, I don't know which of us came off as coolest in that happy time there. But probably Annie, but she was cooler to start with than either of us. Yeah. All right. Remember, folks, you've got one more small group on Wednesday or Thursday. You've got a short complicating lecture. We'll pick up, I think, on some of what Annie said about the eliteness of the Enlightenment and the problems thereof. That comes before Monday's test, so you'll get your last application essay on Friday in class. So you just have to write that over the weekend and upload that before the end of your test on Monday. Any last advice, Sam? Any pitch you want to make for TA office hours, anything like that?
Yeah, I would say make use of the TAs this week. They're really great, especially Annie said, try to like brainstorm connection questions. You don't have to do that on your own. Do that with other people. I think that can be really helpful.
Okay, well, it was good to get the band back together and to do one more webisode in this very odd semester. I don't know if we'll be doing this in the spring again, but I've had fun. Hopefully you all enjoyed it too, students. Hopefully you learned something from this and you found it useful. All right, without further ado, say goodnight, Stacy.